Also I want to introduce to the stage Janna Bystrykh from AMO, who is part of the research team on the Countryside project, and is why will be joining our discussion. So Rem, let me begin with some of the bigger picture. Are you gonna be okay? Begin with some of the bigger picture questions that you raise in the talk, and that are also implied by the project more generally. And so let me start with and I'll ask if it's a distinction that you make between the urban and the countryside, or whether or not one of the things that is up for grabs, or what to be decided, is where that line of division actually falls now.
Yeah.
And the reason I ask this is not only in terms of, is there a shift in the fabric between these, but also one of the things that we see, arguably, is at the scale of, in the political sphere, that the distinctions between voting blocks, political blocks that are in metropolitan centers and those that are in what we might call the countryside, in the US, in France, in the Philippines, in Russia, everywhere, that this distinction has become incredibly important. And so in the dynamic between what is urban, what is countryside, is this an important part of how you see this operating? What do we make of that?
I think it's a very good question, because in the end, it might be that we simply conclude that we are talking about a kind of single phenomenon, and that kind of maybe it makes more sense to talk in terms of ancient parts of civilization, which would be cities, and new parts of civilization, which would be the territories that kind of serve them or kind of support them. But on the other hand, I'm kind of reluctant to say that now, or to agree to that now, because I still think, because even for us in the beginning it was an open question, and I have to say that the more we actually look at the countryside, and the more we go there, and the more we expose ourselves to it, the more I at least see that it's still a relevant term, and still a relevant opposition. Yeah.
Is the okay? I guess
or relevant complementarity, or kind of whatever.
That was kind of, I guess, the question. Do we? Much of what you show, another way of looking at this is that what we thought of the countryside is now very much urban. It's part of an urban system in ways that it hadn't been before. It's not the site of nature. It's in fact the most advanced, where the most advanced technical systems, where the interfaces of the most complex forms of cultural globalization are taking place, and that the urban has absorbed.
But I think that what would you gain by calling it urban?
That's my question.
I don't think you would gain anything, and I think that what is for me the beauty about continuing to talk about the countryside is that it is one name that doesn't imply density, and so that therefore this kind of maybe it is more an opposition between dense and undense, or human occupied by human beings or occupied by machines, that would still let the kind of relevance of the two words intact.
Yes. Yeah. Please.
So just maybe to add a bit, the statistic of the 50-50, which we've become so familiar since 2008, of course also has a history, and I think that's also what we've been looking at, not in a way to redefine it, but more just to familiarize ourselves with what is actually that we're looking at. And as it happens, the UN in the 1950s requested all countries to start monitoring by their own definition what is urban versus rural. So for instance, China counts a city only, at the moment it has 100,000 inhabitants. Denmark, on the other hand, 20,000. So there's an incredibly large spectrum, and in the last 60 years they've been trying to revise it, and sort of there's a lot of criticism coming from geographers and thinkers about it. But UN is always falling back, sort of, we don't want to dictate what defines urban, what defines rural. We want the local knowledge and the local understanding of the context to define what is urban and rural. So I think there is also a lot of flexibility in the system itself, and I think it's a moment to actually reflect on that and not per se maybe look for new definitions.
I'm taken also, I must say, that your last remark of this is where the humans live and the machines live. I mean, traditionally we may say the old motto was that the city was the site of the where the machines lived, and the countryside was where nature was. It was the big garden. And what you show is that this, in fact, is inverting in interesting ways. That the cities is where the humans are, and the countryside is where the machines live.
It seems. Yeah.
It would seem.
Yeah.
Yes. So what do you use the term post-human? Is this part of this ways of thinking? There's a density. It's a density of machines, but not necessarily of hominids that live there. And this is important.
I'm basically deliberately coming here and before my opinions have been definitively crystallized. So it's kind of basically.
Mine too.
So maybe it will never happen, but here we have a deadline. The deadline is 2019, and yes, it's kind of really very exciting to use the word post-human. I think it's also kind of very interesting to consider whether you can turn some of the kind of push for let's say, a kind of universal humanism in architecture back, but how that eventually plays out in 2 years, I don't know. But I have a feeling, yes, it will be kind of part of it.
It'll become back in this way.
No,
with a big capital H, and the Vitruvian man in the middle.
That it's kind of worth questioning the kind of sensitivity that architecture has adopted in the last 20 years.
So one thing I think we have to raise, also you mentioned this in your remarks, and you both did, on the relationship between the kinds of lives and systems that work there is, particularly with the data centers. Let's take this as an example, which very much are a countryside phenomenon, right? Because of the area, but also the water, right? They're like nuclear power plants. They have to be near large water sources in this way as well. But the impact that they have had on urban economies remotely, as these big remote control switches we're still beginning to figure out. And one of the ways in which they have is they enable the kinds of large-scale platforms, whether that's an Google or an Uber, Airbnb, most obvious, to take the most obvious examples, but really in many ways more important, less visible logistical and infrastructural services that make cities run. Right? In a way, they are kind of the frontal cortex of the city is out over there. And so you talked, I think, quite about some of the architectural marvels and design questions of the box as it sits out there. But how would you characterize that dynamic between the data center out there and the cities that it's running as a design problem? One that's more, maybe less tangible, but certainly one that is undeniable, I would say.
Why do you ask for it as a design problem? Why do you ask as a design issue?
I'm asking, I want, if you see this as the relationship as something as a design problem, and if so, how so?
Well, I think that my kind of perception is that through some kind of, in general, uncritical enthusiasm for a particular direction of technology to develop, and an incredibly kind of smart and systematic rhetoric of embracing kind of every new technological step, we are finding ourselves in a situation of extreme vulnerability and kind of really questionable dependency.
I mean, from my part, I totally agree, and this is why I want to ask this question in this way, because I think it hasn't been dealt with. It's taken as a kind of inevitabilities, and we end up with a lot of, the kinds of smart city rhetorics that are useless to actually this way. So how do we think about this relationship in a way that isn't isn't stupid?
So we have to kind of really begin to think about it, and also develop. Without being able to kind of reverse it, a critical and intelligent attitude, and so I think that also the kind of issue that kind of simply kind of one virus can kind of completely immobilize the planet needs to also be addressed, I guess, on the scale of data centers, and find new ways of kind of making them immune to those kind of conditions. So I think it's a kind of combination of architectural, technical, political kind of thinking that is necessary.
I agree. I mean, I take your answer in a way of maybe rephrasing my question.
Thank you.
Your answer was maybe rephrasing my main question more for everything. Did you want to speak to this?
Yeah, I also wonder, I think that's something that maybe not has been mentioned so far, is the aspect of energy. Because I think the landscape that are being designed, it's not just a matter of shape or scale and so on, but it's also a matter of how much energy they consume, and how much within a nation the shift goes from cities where energy previously was consumed, they now have to be placed remotely in order for them to be able to even sustain themselves, that they would cause blackouts in cities. And so they by themselves have overridden any kind of desire that we might have towards their aesthetic and pushed themselves out. And we are trying to reinvent that perhaps.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But I have a question to you, because you said kind of very confidently you didn't want to kind of push genies back into the bottle. Just kind of 40 minutes ago.
No genies, no bottles, yes.
And so instinctively I agree, but I think that is that kind of really the whole story, or do you think some things have to go back to the bottle?
I allow for new bottles, but not the old bottles. Better bottles, better stadia and system for the genies to arrange themselves. Quite obviously, not to let them free and assume that somehow they're predetermined, and we just need to get out of their way, or something like this. These kinds of things is exactly not the point quite of as well. It's the idea that in order to address them in a way in which we can make sense of them, that we can use them and work with them in a ways that it would be viable and sort of beneficial, is that they need to be articulated within the framework of those this way. So that's what I mean by bottle. So another. One of the things also we've looked at a lot in the program, I suppose what to think about it is the role of spectrum in the city, the electromagnetic spectrum of the city, right? Most of the phones that we use, these black glass slabs that have, retrained the way in which the posture of billions of people as they move through the cities, are all dependent on an invisible electromagnetic spectrum that has its own borders, that has its own policies, that has its own police, that has its own police imagination, or this as well, but isn't physical in the same way. It isn't one of the things that you included, for example, in the elements of architecture thing as a tangible thing, and I think quite rightly, because it hasn't been dealt with architecture in this way. But I would posit that it's become an element of architecture as fundamental as any of the forms that we would use with this as well. And another thing that we need to develop is that the vocabulary and the bringing the architectural imagination to its contouring.
Yeah, it's true. You were announcing your books. We are now publishing the definitive book on elements of architecture, and it has a lot more about that kind of world. So we're now talking about it.
What does it say? Is it referred to as an element in the same way? I'm quite curious of how it's positioned in this pantheon of
Of course, it can never be an element in the same way because it's the element to end all elements in a certain way. So you cannot consider it in isolation. I think it's an element that has infiltrated every element and is kind of surreptitiously changing every element and now kind of probably guided by this kind of central thing.
Mhm.
So it's the element the ultimate element, I guess. Yeah.
Did you want to speak to this? Or is this sort of
Not directly to this, but something that came up in conversations while doing interviews with people who are related to data centers. I think in relationship to security, what struck me was that also the culture of security is an evolving thing. And one of the comments, and we still have to check and double check whether this applies to other areas, but this particular expert was speaking to a trend that initially a lot of the data centers were built by former military staff. Right. Thereby, the culture of surveillance was extremely severe. And this is sort of early 90s, early 2000. And then after that, there was some kind of lax and people started to come down again, and then it's spiking up again. So I think it's also interesting to see that it's not a progressive trend all the time in one direction, but it's also a cultural exchange of people who are involved, what kind of industries are attached, and so on.
So, I suppose another angle into this is, as I see it, and I want to sort of put this out there, is a shift perhaps in where we might locate program in architecture. In that it's one thing to sort of think about a distribution of program in plan and say, well, this is the zone where the people do this, and this is a zone where they do that, and there might be moments of encounter and disjunction, and they move between this, and you can actually build a sectional model of a micro society and build it, and it sort of works. But when everyone in that space is co-occupying that space differently according to the way the slab is narrating the space to this, the slippage becomes it becomes quite severe. And there are ways in which you think of program, particularly in terms of staging experiences, assuming this in this way. And so another question I would ask is, considering the importance of the programmatic imaginary to your work for so long, what becomes of it? The same can be said of zoning, let's say, even at the scale of the urban scale of this as well.
Yeah,
is this another way in which the spectrum?
That's kind of really a very kind of correct question, and you kind of will notice that we never use the word program anymore, and so I think that's we are in a kind of holding pattern in terms of being able to define how it morphed or into what it morphed.
Did it morph into and where does it go and how can it be specified in this as well? So I know we've both had some conversations with some of the same people at Google, and you've done some other things. There was a talk of yours I was watching recently of the fellow from Google Nest. I've sort of done this as well, so I know there's kind of interest. One of the things that it sees me, and please jump in, that part of the shift towards the primacy of spectrum in this way, and the impact is on design, is that it has changed the way in which perhaps, or it wants to change the way in which architecture thinks about the occupant. It pushes a narrative of the occupant or the habitat as user, and so all of this discourse of user-centered design construction are sort of around this problematic this as well. I know you were talking about a lot of the surveillance and privacy conundrums of this kinds of quantification of experience and the ways that the platforms serve this as well. But I guess what's at stake then for the ambition for design when those who would occupy these spaces are reduced to this status? Well, or is that the right way of asking this? I'm trying to provoke your most polemic response to these smart...
The kind of interesting thing is I've always felt kind of vulnerable in terms of clearly not being a kind of digital expert. And the word digital has always made me cringe. and cringe, not because of any hostility, but anyway, as a domain that was stronger than me and where I couldn't that I couldn't get hold on, let's say. But if I look at my own career and the kind of friendships I've had in that career, I've actually kind of been working kind of since the mid-70s, kind of with a Dutch filmmaker who is quite well known in architectural circles, kind of René Daalder. Where we were actually,
I know quite well as well. Yeah.
Kind of people who are sitting here, where we actually kind of really considered kind of what the effect of the kind of world was going to be, kind of the digital domain. So I can also look at, let's say, our own work over the last 40 years as a constant balancing act or a constant investigation what the impact of the digital would be, how we could kind of survive it, engage it, work with it, work against it, blah, blah, blah. And I think the one maybe definition that is turning out to be quite robust is the one where which we used for the first time in 1981 in the context of the very big library in Paris, where we said that kind of basically architecture will always be necessary to accommodate our persistent desire for collectivity, and therefore a meeting like this is a kind of very kind of typical case. It's for the time being it's impossible to kind of consider that this will not be happening anymore. Yeah? So.
And perhaps this gets, I mean, I think what we see in your work is perhaps a trend towards this getting pushed in more extreme and bifurcated situation where you either, there's architecture either accommodating these kinds of visceral, in-person, the experience of the crowd, kinds of staged events, or it's set up for purely the sort of smoothness of logistical flows. It's either an Amazon warehouse or a Tesla showroom and nothing in between seems to be something sort of the trend. Okay, So
let's end. Let's end here.
That's it. Then we figured this out. Okay. No, I wanted to. You know, when we spoke about this, we talked about the one thing we had was that a lot of the projects that you show, the architecture that you show in these projects, you don't mention in many cases the architects that made them because they were, you know, the warehouses and restaurants because they were done by quote industrial architecture firms, right? That are not part of an academic discourse, that are not known. There are no coffee table books about the work of Bechtel or Halliburton, and yet the case can be made that not only many of the most technologically interesting but intellectually interesting questions that architecture is working out are being done by this kind of work. So. Do you foresee, and or even would you hope for a kind of shift in that relationship between the high design and industrial types of practices? Is there a way in which the practice may evolve to accommodate this? And if so, what does that pathway look like?
We are beginning to collaborate, and so therefore, yes, absolutely. I think that it's a collaboration in which I can expect enormous things. Partly to unlearn and partly also to kind of completely reconstruct our vocabulary and our ambitions.
So we can not only design firms taking on the capabilities of the industrial architects, but that the industrial architecture can be infused with the same kind of
perhaps
narrative ambition, let's say. This is
or our architecture be infused with the same ability to say nothing. Yeah.
Yeah, this is great. I'm for that. This is great.
And that's also kind of result I'm kind of looking forward to.
Yeah, I think so. Or less than this. Yeah. So I wanted we should wrap up pretty soon. I wanted though, since we're on the occasion of being in Moscow on almost the 4th of July. Across from the Kremlin here as well, is it to invite you both to speak a little bit more about the implications for these trends, this work in the Russian context in particular, some of the things we've talked about, and I think we'll see in some of the project works, have to do with Russia's unique and position within. But please go ahead. You follow the point.
I actually would love to do that later, maybe, after seeing the Russian work.
Sure.
Yeah.
This is what. Okay. After we see the Russian work, after we see some of the.
We're looking at projects.
Okay.
Maybe after. Yeah.
All right. I'd like to talk. Then we have a few minutes left. Then we won't talk about Russia. What I'd like then is I mentioned one of the things that has been an important part of the meta discussion within this is the structure of practices and the structure of design practices and the ways in which this has worked. And perhaps as I mentioned in the introduction, your own work and your own practice has been extraordinarily interdisciplinary. Working with filmmakers, it's run in political science, economists, and all the rest of it, these kinds of things as well. A lot of practices now drawing in computer scientists, interaction designers, and all the rest of this as well. I guess the question just sort of lobbied, and really to both, especially in the context of education, is the importance or status as you see it of that interdisciplinarity, or whether that really is an interdisciplinarity, and that if that's the right word to think about these kinds of things. And the design of the practice itself as an argument.
I think it's a very important word, but I'm actually, I think, representative of more spontaneous. I do not see our own activity as interdisciplinary. I just see it as kind of touching and mobilizing many different kind of forces. Simply not as a kind of a priori ambition, but simply because we realize that complexities cannot be kind of understood by only one kind of form of intelligence, and that. So it's a, and I think I prefer to remain seeing it as a kind of necessity that you can respond to, case by case. By accumulating kind of knowledge around you when it's necessary.
I think just to go back to an earlier point, we were talking about the industrial architect.
Yes, please.
I think what is quite interesting that came out also of a number of interviews that we're doing is that they function in a different reality in a way. So they have 3 weeks to design a data center, and they're doing 80 or so at the same time. And so the pace of production, the pace of design is something different. And I think that's why the collaboration is so exciting, because they have taken on a completely different way of approaching architecture. Yet they are still designing for humans, and sort of like within their sequence of watts to how much air needs to be pumped. Sort of the human does appear at some point, but it's all within a spectrum of 3 weeks.
And correct me wrong, but you mentioned in the Gigafactory, which figures prominently in the story as a kind of exemplary to figure this as well. Tesla brought in a lot of this intelligence in this as well. They worked with different architects, but they built out this in-house intelligence as part of this as well. And so for them, the architecture was just another part of the production process in a certain sort of way. So I wonder if you might comment on this as a larger, as a trend of how the large platforms use and engage architecture not as an on-call service, but as a core competency, or how should that be? Should that also be seen as part of a central part of this trend?
I have no idea. I've seen kind of enormous kind of sections of these domains to be completely immune to architecture and to be completely happy to live, without any kind of reference, any participation, any kind of indulgence, kind of architecture. So it's a kind of really, in that sense, I don't expect a kind of very soon kind of great interactivity.
Well, I'm with you. I think the architect. I'm ready to move into the Olafur Eliasson food factory thing that you sort of have. But I mean,
seeking anonymity, I think, as well as designers.
Sorry.
And seeking anonymity as designers.
But what I meant, I guess, as the sort of thinking about this question of practice and the trends, as opposed to way, for example, Google engaged Björk Ingels and Heatherwick, is to sort of bringing in these named architects to help them solve the problem. Tesla, in fact, kind of just tried to absorb and learn this and make it an in-house kind of structure. So the ways, there's different ways in which the platforms might work as well, and it would seem to me to be part of the story quite clearly.
Yeah, and I think Google, for instance, they bring in sort of the acknowledgement and the attention only for a specific type of projects. They also work a lot with small practices who are easy to work with, who are able to produce quickly, and that's the majority of their expansion, which we don't particularly see.
We don't have the Thomas Heatherwick data centers yet at this sort of point as well. Yeah. Is there anything you'd like to add to this or to put on the table for our discussion over the next few days?
I'm looking forward to the rest.
To the rest as well?
To the rest, yeah.
Good. Maybe we wrap it up there then as well. Okay, thank you so much.